The sun was setting behind the neat row of houses as Andrew pulled his blue sedan into the driveway of his childhood home. The golden-orange light cast long shadows across the well-kept lawn that his father still mowed every Sunday without fail. It had been nearly 2 years since Andrew had walked through that familiar front door, 2 years filled with sandstorms, gunfire, and the kind of brotherhood only found among soldiers who face death together. Andrew switched off the engine and sat for a moment, taking in the sight of the 2-story brick house where he'd grown up. Nothing much had changed. The same American flag hanging by the door, the same flower beds his mother had planted before she passed, now carefully maintained by his father's rough but gentle hands. The basketball hoop above the garage still hung slightly crooked from that time Andrew had dumped too hard after making varsity in high school. Home, he whispered to himself, feeling both like the Army Ranger he'd become and the boy who once raced his bike down this very driveway. The neighborhood was quiet as evening settled in. Lights flickered on in windows along the street, families gathering for dinner, kids being called in from play. Andrew hadn't told his father exactly when he arrived. He wanted it to be a surprise. He could already imagine the look on the old man's face. His father, Thomas Johnson, wasn't just any retired military man. In the Special Forces community, Command Sergeant Major Johnson was a living legend. 22 years in Delta Force had earned him medals he never displayed and respect he never demanded. After Andrew's mother died from cancer when he was 14, it had just been the two of them. His father had somehow balanced being both the toughest man, Andrew knew, and the most loving parent a boy could ask for. Andrew stepped out of the car, his boots crunching on the gravel. The evening air felt different from the harsh desert climate he'd grown accustomed to, softer, filled with the scent of fresh-cut grass and someone grilling nearby. He stretched his back, stiff from the long drive from Fort Benning, and moved to open his trunk. Inside was his military-issued duffel bag, olive green and stuffed with everything he owned that mattered. His dress uniform was carefully folded on top, ready for his cousin's wedding that weekend, another reason for his visit home. As Andrew leaned into the trunk to grab his bag, he didn't notice the curtain twitching in the house across the street. He didn't see Mrs. Winters, who had moved in 6 months ago and had never met Thomas's son, picking up her phone with shaking hands to report a suspicious person breaking into the Johnson house. After a string of break-ins 3 streets over, the neighborhood watch had been on high alert. Andrew hefted his duffel over his shoulder, feeling the familiar weight settle against his back. He closed the trunk and turned toward the house, imagining his father probably dozing in his favorite recliner in front of the evening news. The porch light wasn't on yet. Thomas always waited until full dark to save on the electric bill, a habit from his own childhood during tougher times. What Andrew couldn't know was that 2 patrol officers were already turning onto his street, responding to a possible burglary in progress. He couldn't know that his homecoming was about to turn into something very different from the warm reunion he had imagined. He walked up the short path to the front door, key in hand, completely unaware that in just moments, his and his father's lives would change forever. Andrew was halfway up the front walk when bright headlights swept across the yard. A police cruiser pulled up sharply to the curb, its tires making a soft screech against the asphalt. Before Andrew could fully process what was happening, a second patrol car arrived, boxing in his sedan. "Hey, what's going on?" Andrew called out, confused but not yet alarmed. He'd grown up respecting police officers. His father had taught him that. The car doors swung open, and 2 officers emerged with surprising speed. What shocked Andrew was that both had their weapons drawn, pointing directly at him. "Drop the bag. Hands where we can see them. Now." The commands came rapid fire from the taller officer, a man with a crew cut whose nameplate read Officer Wilson. Andrew's military training kicked in instantly. He slowly placed his duffel on the ground and raised his hands, palms forward. The porch light suddenly came on, casting harsh shadows across the scene. "Officers, I think there's been a misunderstanding," Andrew said, keeping his voice calm and steady despite the adrenaline now pumping through his system. "This is my father's house. I just got back from." "I said don't move," the second officer shouted, cutting him off. This one was younger, maybe a rookie, and Andrew could see the slight tremble in his hands. That worried Andrew more than anything. A nervous trigger finger was dangerous. "I'm not moving," Andrew replied, still keeping his voice level. But I live here. My father is inside. I'm just coming home from my army tour. The officers exchanged glances but didn't lower their weapons. The rookie stepped forward. We got a call about a break-in at this address. No break-in. I have my key right here, Andrew said, then realized his mistake. His hand had moved slightly toward his pocket. Hands up, don't reach, Wilson barked, taking an aggressive step forward. Andrew froze, his heart hammering in his chest. 20 months in combat zones, and now he was staring down gun barrels in his own front yard. The irony wasn't lost on him. My ID is in my back pocket, Andrew tried again. My name is Andrew Johnson. My father is Thomas Johnson. He's been living here for 30 years. You can call him. He's probably inside watching TV. The rookie looked uncertain now, but Wilson's stance remained rigid. Turn around slowly. Hands on your head. Interlace your fingers. Andrew complied, moving with deliberate slowness. The gravel crunched under his boots as he turned his back to the officers, something that went against every instinct he had. He placed his hands on his head, fingers interlocked as instructed. I'm going to approach and check your ID, Wilson said. Any sudden movements end. You don't need to finish that sentence, officer, Andrew said quietly. I understand. He could hear Wilson's footsteps approaching from behind. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut. Some way down the street, a dog started barking. Then came the sound Andrew had been dreading, the front door opening. His father would be walking into this standoff blind. What's going on out here? Thomas's deep voice rang out from the porch. Andrew felt Wilson hesitate behind him. Sir, stay inside. Police business. Dad, it's me. Andrew called over his shoulder, not daring to turn around. There's been some confusion. But Thomas was already coming down the steps, moving with the measured confidence of a man who had faced far worse situations than this. That's my son you're pointing those weapons at, he said, his voice carrying that unmistakable tone of command that had made soldiers stand straight for decades. The rookie, startled by Thomas's sudden appearance, swung his weapon toward this new potential threat. In the same moment, Andrew instinctively took a step toward his father, wanting to shield him. He's moving, the rookie shouted, and then came the sound that would change everything, the sharp crack of a gunshot splitting the evening air. The gunshot echoed through the quiet neighborhood, followed by a moment of terrible silence. Andrew felt a burning sensation across his upper arm and stumbled sideways. The bullet had grazed him, tearing through his sleeve and leaving a line of fire along his skin. Andrew. Thomas shouted, his voice breaking with fear for his son. Time seemed to slow down. Thomas Johnson had spent decades in situations where seconds meant the difference between life and death. Without hesitation, he moved down the remaining steps with his hands clearly visible. I am Command Sergeant Major Thomas Johnson, retired United States Army Delta Force, he announced, his voice carrying the weight of his 58 years, 22 of them spent in the most elite Special Operations Unit in the military. That is my son you just shot at. He is an Army Ranger, just returned from his second tour overseas. The younger officer looked shocked at what had just happened, his gun now trembling visibly in his hands. Officer Wilson was frozen, caught between training protocols and the sudden realization that the situation was nothing like what they'd been called for. Sir, I need you to go back inside, Wilson finally managed, but his voice lacked conviction. Thomas ignored the command, continuing his steady approach. Each step was deliberate, non-threatening, yet filled with unmistakable authority. He'd walked into hostile villages in Afghanistan the same way, had faced down warlords and terrorists with this same measured calm. My son is bleeding, Thomas stated flatly. I'm going to check on him. He's going to sit down, right there on the grass, and we're all going to take a breath. Andrew, clutching his arm, did as his father suggested without being told twice. He lowered himself to the grass, wincing at the sting of the wound. It wasn't serious. He'd had worse from barbed wire during training, but the shock of being shot at home, in his father's front yard, was overwhelming. Officer, Thomas continued, now standing between the police and his son, I understand you're responding to a call. Someone saw a strange man at my house and got worried. That's fine. That's your job. But what's happening right now isn't right, and you know it. Wilson finally lowered his weapon slightly, though not completely. "Sir, we had a report of a break-in." The suspect was, "My son, Thomas cut him off, has a key to this house. This has been his home since he was 4 years old. Look at the photos on the wall inside if you need proof." His voice remained steady, but there was steel beneath the calm. This was the voice that had directed counter-terrorism operations, that had made decisions with national security implications. Lights were coming on in neighboring houses now. Curious and concerned faces peered through windows. Someone was filming from across the street. The rookie officer looked increasingly uncomfortable. "We should call an ambulance," he said, holstering his weapon with shaking hands. "Yes, you should," Thomas agreed. "And your superior officer too." A third police car pulled up, this one unmarked. A man in plainclothes stepped out, taking in the scene with a quick professional assessment. He approached with caution, badge in hand. "What's going on here?" he asked, looking between the officers and Thomas, who still stood protectively near his seated son. Before either officer could answer, Thomas turned to face the newcomer. The porch light illuminated his features clearly now, the silver at his temples, the lines around his eyes that had deepened during countless classified missions, and the ramrod straight posture that hadn't softened in retirement. "Lieutenant," Thomas said, recognizing the rank from the badge. "I believe these officers responded to a call about a possible break-in. What they found instead was my son, home from military service, being welcomed with a bullet." The lieutenant's eyes widened slightly as he took in Thomas's bearing, the way he spoke, the unmistakable presence of someone used to command. And then a flicker of recognition crossed his face. The lieutenant stepped closer, his eyes fixed on Thomas's face. The night air seemed to still around them as understanding dawned on him. "Wait a minute," he said, his voice dropping almost to a whisper. "Command Sergeant Major Johnson, from the Kandahar operation in 05. Thomas's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes, surprise perhaps at being recognized. "I was a Marine, 2nd Battalion," the lieutenant continued. "Lieutenant Ray Carter. You pulled my unit out when we got pinned down near the valley." A small nod from Thomas. "That was a long time ago, Lieutenant." "You saved 16 of my men that day," Carter said, then turned sharply to the two officers who were watching the exchange with confusion. "Stand down now. Weapons holstered." The change in the atmosphere was immediate. Wilson finally lowered his gun completely, and the rookie quickly followed suit. "Sir," Carter addressed Thomas with genuine respect, "I can't begin to apologize enough for this situation." Then, looking at Andra, who was still sitting on the grass holding his wounded arm, "We need to get your son medical attention right away." Thomas knelt beside Andra, examining the wound with experienced hands. "It's a graze. Clean shot through the flesh, no bone." He spoke like a man who had seen far worse, who had treated gunshot wounds under enemy fire with nothing but a field kit. Andra managed a tight smile. "Had worse from barbed wire at Fort Benning, Dad." Carter spoke into his radio, calling for an ambulance while simultaneously ordering the other officers to secure the scene differently, not as a crime scene, but as the site of an unfortunate mistake. Neighbors had begun to gather at the edges of the property, kept back by the police tape that Wilson was now stringing up with subdued movements. Whispers spread through the small crowd as the story began to piece together in fragments of conversation. "That's Mr. Johnson's son. Someone called in a false report. The police shot him in his own yard. His father was some kind of war hero." Carver knelt down beside Thomas and Andra. "The ambulance will be here in 5 minutes. I've also called the chief. He's on his way." He paused, clearly struggling with what to say next. "Command Sergeant Major, I know no words can make this right, but I want you to know who you are dealing with. I will personally ensure this is handled properly." Thomas looked up from tending his son's wound. "You were a good lieutenant in Afghanistan, Carter. I remember you now. Kept your head when things went sideways." His voice was steady, professional, one soldier to another. "I'm trusting you'll do the same here." Carter nodded solemnly. The wail of an approaching ambulance filled the air. Andrew's face was pale from shock and blood loss, though the wound itself was relatively minor. Thomas kept pressure on it with a clean handkerchief he pulled from his pocket. "Dad," Andrew said quietly, so only his father could hear, "I spent 20 months overseas. taking fire in 3 different countries. Never thought I'd get shot in our front yard. Thomas's hand tightened slightly on his son's good shoulder. I know, son. I know. There was a depth of understanding between them that went beyond words. The shared knowledge of what it meant to serve, to face danger, and to come home thinking you were safe. As the ambulance pulled up, its red and blue lights casting strange shadows across the familiar yard, the rookie officer approached hesitantly. His face was ashen, his hands still trembling slightly. Sir, he said to Thomas, I'm the one who fired. I want to say. Thomas cut him off with a raised hand. Not now, officer. My son needs medical attention. We'll have plenty of time to talk after that. His tone wasn't angry, but it left no room for argument. The authority in his voice was something earned through decades of command decisions, of bearing responsibility for the lives of others. The emergency room was bright and busy, even at this late hour. Andra sat on the edge of a hospital bed, his arm freshly bandaged. The doctor, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a no-nonsense manner, had just finished explaining that he was lucky. The bullet had only grazed him, taking a strip of skin but missing anything important. Keep it clean and dry, she instructed, signing his discharge papers. Change the bandage daily. Come back if you see any signs of infection. Thomas stood nearby, his posture still military straight despite the exhaustion in his eyes. The past 3 hours had been a blur of paramedics, police statements, and hospital forms. Thank you, doctor, he said simply. As the doctor left, the door opened again. Lieutenant Carter stepped in, followed by a tall man in a suit. Even without the badge clipped to his belt, everything about him screamed police chief, from his carefully neutral expression to the way he carried himself. Command Sergeant Major Johnson. I'm Chief Reynolds, the man said, extending his hand to Thomas. I want to personally apologize for what happened tonight. Thomas shook the offered hand but said nothing. He had learned long ago that silence often said more than words. The chief's eyes moved to Andra. And to you, sir, there are no words adequate for what you experienced. I'm deeply sorry. Andra nodded, accepting the apology but too tired to say much. The pain medication was kicking in, making the edges of the world soft. Chief Reynolds cleared his throat. I've reviewed the officer's body camera footage. Officer Wilson has been placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation. The rookie, Officer Tanner, is devastated by his actions. He's a new recruit, only 3 months out of the academy. Being new isn't an excuse for shooting at an unarmed man on his own property, Thomas said quietly. No, sir, it is not, the chief agreed. That's why I'm here. We need to address this head-on. The footage will be made public tomorrow. Transparency is the only way forward. But I wanted to meet with you first, hear what you think should happen next. Thomas raised an eyebrow, surprised at being consulted. In his experience, police departments closed ranks when things went wrong. The media's already picked up the story, Lieutenant Carter added. It'll be everywhere by morning. Police shoot black veteran in his own yard. People are angry. Thomas glanced at his son, who was looking increasingly drowsy from the medication. They should be angry, he said, but riots and more violence won't help anyone. The chief nodded. That's exactly why I'm here. You command respect, sir. From what Lieutenant Carter tells me, you've got more experience handling volatile situations than anyone in my department. Your voice would carry weight. Thomas understood what wasn't being said. They'd wanted him to help control the narrative, to prevent the community's justifiable anger from boiling over. I don't work for you, Chief, Thomas said plainly. My loyalty is to my son and my community. I understand that, Chief Reynolds replied. I'm not asking you to cover for us. I'm asking for your help to make something good come from this terrible mistake. Andrew shifted on the bed. Dad, he said softly, remember what you always told me. Be part of the solution. Thomas looked at his son, the boy he'd raised alone after his wife died, the young man who'd followed him into military service, now sitting in a hospital gown with a bandaged arm because of someone's fear and poor training. A nurse appeared at the door. We're ready to discharge Mr. Johnson, she announced. Thomas took a deep breath. 22 years in Delta Force had taught him that the hardest battles often weren't fought with weapons. Sometimes the real test of strength was choosing the harder path toward lasting change, rather than the easier path of justified rage. "I'll need to see that body camera footage," he finally said to the chief. "All of it, and then we'll talk about what happens next." 3 days after the shooting, Thomas stood at the front of the police department's largest training room. The space was packed with officers in uniform, their faces a mix of defensiveness, curiosity, and in some cases, open resentment. At the back of the room, Chief Reynolds stood with his arms crossed, watching. Thomas wore no uniform today, just a simple button-down shirt and slacks, but he carried himself with unmistakable military bearing. A projector hummed behind him, ready to display the presentation he'd spent the past 48 hours preparing. "Many of you don't want to be here," Thomas began, his deep voice carrying to every corner of the room without him having to raise it. "You think I'm going to stand up here and tell you how terrible you all are because one officer made a split-second bad decision. That's not why I'm here." He clicked a button, and the screen lit up with an image that made several officers shift uncomfortably in their seats, the first frame from Officer Tanner's body camera footage, showing Ander with his hands up. "This is my son," Thomas said simply. "He served 2 tours as an Army Ranger. The night he came home, he was shot in our front yard because he looked suspicious taking his bag out of his car." Another click, another image, this one from Thomas's military days, showing him in full combat gear with his Delta Force team, faces blurred for security. "I spent 22 years in situations where making the wrong call meant people died. Not just my team, but civilians, children, families. We operated in places where everyone looked like a potential threat, where the guy smiling at you might have a bomb strapped to his chest." Thomas paused, letting that sink in. "And you know what? In 22 years, my team never once fired first. Not once. Because we were trained to identify actual threats, not just people who made us nervous." A murmur ran through the room. Thomas ignored it and continued. "The difference between a soldier who comes home and one who comes home in a box often isn't their shooting skills. It's their ability to assess a situation correctly under pressure." For the next 20 minutes, Thomas walked them through real scenarios from his military career, hostage situations, ambushes, tense standoffs, explaining the decision-making process that had kept his teams alive and minimized civilian casualties. He used simple language but didn't talk down to them, drawing parallels between war zones and domestic policing that even the most resistant officers found themselves nodding along with. Then he showed them something unexpected, footage from a training exercise his unit had developed. "This is what we call stress inoculation," Thomas explained as the video showed soldiers facing increasingly tense scenarios while their vital signs were monitored. "Your body has natural reactions to fear, increased heart rate, tunnel vision, loss of fine motor control. These reactions can save your life, but they can also make you shoot an innocent kid holding a cell phone." Officer Tanner, sitting in the front row, flinched visibly at these words. "The good news," Thomas continued, "is that these reactions can be managed. You can train your body and mind to stay clear even when everything inside you is screaming danger." He clicked to a new slide that outlined a training program. "Chief Reynolds has asked me to work with your department to implement something similar to what we used in special operations. It's voluntary, but I'll tell you this, it works. It saves lives on both sides of the badge." The room was silent now, all eyes fixed on him. "I could have gone to the media," Thomas said, his voice quieter but no less powerful. "I could have called for Officer Tanner's badge, filed lawsuits, fanned the flames of anger that are already burning in our community. That would have been easy." He looked directly at Tanner now, whose eyes were red-rimmed from lack of sleep. "Instead, I'm choosing to be part of making sure what happened to my son doesn't happen to someone else's son. Not because I forgive and forget, but because real change takes more than anger and punishment. It takes work. Hard, uncomfortable work that forces us all to be better." Thomas clicked to his final slide. A simple calendar with dates for the new training program. "So who's willing to do that work with me?" 6 months had passed since that night in Thomas's front yard. The summer heat had given way to fall colors, and now those too had faded into the crisp clarity of winter. Thomas sat in a conference room at City Hall, reviewing training reports spread across the table before him. The door opened and Ander walked in, no longer wearing a bandage on his arm, though a thin scar remained as a permanent reminder. He'd grown a short beard since the incident and carried himself with the same quiet confidence as his father. "Sorry I'm late," Andrew said, setting down 2 cups of coffee. "Traffic was bad downtown. There's some kind of celebration at the park." Thomas smiled. "That celebration is partially because of you, son. Today marked the official launch of the Community Safety Initiative, a program that had grown from Thomas's initial training sessions with the police department into something much larger. What had started as crisis response training had expanded into a comprehensive overhaul of police procedures, community engagement, and accountability measures. The door opened again. Officer Tanner, now promoted to the Community Outreach Division, entered, followed by Lieutenant Carter and Chief Reynolds. The last to arrive was Mrs. Winters, the neighbor whose call had set everything in motion 6 months earlier. "Everyone's here," Chief Reynolds said, taking a seat at the table. "Let's review before the press conference." Thomas nodded, gathering his thoughts. Outside the window, he could see people gathering in the park across from City Hall, community members, officers in uniform, local news crews setting up cameras. "When I was in Delta Force," Thomas began, "we had a saying. The mission isn't over until everyone's home safe. 6 months ago, my son came home, but he wasn't safe. Today, we're taking a real step toward making sure everyone in this community can feel safe, whether they're walking down the street or interacting with law enforcement." He slid a folder across the table to Chief Reynolds. "The final numbers from our trial program show a 70% reduction in use of force incidents and community complaints down by 65%. The officers who completed the training report feeling more confident in high-stress situations." Officer Tanner nodded. "The de-escalation techniques alone have changed how we approach every call. I used to see threats everywhere. Now I see people first." Mrs. Winters, who had initially been reluctant to join the oversight committee, spoke up. "And people are starting to see the police differently too. The community meetings have made a real difference." Thomas hadn't planned on becoming so deeply involved in police reform. He'd expected to offer some training, share his expertise, and return to his quiet retirement. But somewhere along the way, he'd found a new mission. Andrew had found one too. After recovering from his injury, he turned down a private security job to work alongside his father, developing training programs that were now being requested by police departments in neighboring counties. Lieutenant Carter checked his watch. "It's time," he said. "They're waiting for us." As they walked toward the park, Thomas and Andrew side by side, followed by the others, people turned to watch. Some nodded in recognition or respect. A few approached to shake hands or offer thanks. At the podium set up in the center of the park, the mayor was already speaking, talking about a model for departments across the country and turning tragedy into transformation. Thomas wasn't much for public speaking or politics. He'd always preferred action to words. But today's ceremony would launch the program officially, securing its funding for the next 5 years and establishing the Civilian Oversight Committee as a permanent part of police operations. As they reached the edge of the crowd, Andrew paused. "You know, Dad, when I came home that night, I never imagined this would be the result." Thomas put a hand on his son's shoulder. "That's how change happens sometimes. Not because people plan it, but because when something goes wrong, someone decides to make it right." The mayor gestured toward them, inviting them forward. As they walked through the crowd, Thomas saw Officer Tanner in his dress uniform, standing tall. The young man who had fired in fear 6 months ago now moved with new confidence, the kind that came not from authority, but from knowing how to use it wisely. "Command Sergeant Major Johnson," the mayor said into the microphone, "would you and your son like to say a few words about the program you've built together?" Thomas stepped up to the podium, with Andrew beside him. This wasn't a military mission anymore. It was something perhaps even more important, building a community where everyone could truly come home safe,